Anyone want to raise their hand with a burning question while they're finding their seats? Rasik, over there.
Progressor. This is my question. This question for all of the speakers here. How would pulling out of the EU affect freshwater conservation in Britain?
Don't do it.
I'd agree with that.
I think the Habitats and Birds Directive have been absolutely key to a lot of the things that we've done in the last 20 years, nature conservation in the UK. I think coming out of the EU for those reasons alone would be a disaster. And the lack of debate about anything other than nationalism is incredibly disappointing by our politicians. I think the benefits that we get from the EU in terms of the legislation that's incorporated into UK law is just not being talked about. So from my personal perspective, I think it would be a disaster. And I think the campaign that that various partners have run in terms of protection of the directives has been really important. And the fact that we got over 500,000 respondents across the EU in support of genuine, individuals responding indicated how important that those two pieces of legislation have been and how people perceive them in Europe.
Do any of the speakers have opposing views? I'm just trying to shorten this particular question because we could spend the rest of the afternoon on it.
I do just very slightly, and that is to say that obviously a lot of the European directives are enshrined in UK law, so I think that's an important distinction to make here. We're not talking about law that Europe has given to us and is dependent upon Europe, although the origin may have been Europe, which I agree is important. I don't think it's going to be the falling down of a house of cards. Everyone in this room is passionate about conservation of the environment, and I think we need to make sure that we don't necessarily jump to massive conclusions and do whatever we can, irrespective of the political situation, irrespective of what government's in power and all of that. It's very important that we keep our heads on and do what we can on the ground. So I don't think it would necessarily be as catastrophic as it may have been built up to be here, and I think that reactionary responses to leaving the EU won't necessarily help our case. We're all great at doing the stuff that we've heard about today. We just need to keep on that, irrespective of what politicians decide.
The other thing I would say is that wildlife doesn't have a passport, and something like the Birds Directive demonstrated why we need that kind of legislation. Birds are migratory, and we need a suite of sites across Europe and wider to protect migratory species. So if we're coming out of the EU, we need to ensure that that there is provision for doing stuff at an international scale. And again, it's something that politicians are simply not speaking about.
Okay. Any other speakers of Burning want to answer that one? Okay, let's move on. Kind of another hand up. Right at the back there. Lady with the mic behind you.
The RSPB man, please. Lake and Heath, when's the best time to see the cranes?
Now.
Now, okay, right.
The next month, basically. I mean, both our resident pairs are back on the reserve now. They've kicked out last year's youngsters. So there are 3 unhappy teenage cranes mooching around, desperately trying to get back with their parents. Parents are not having any of it. But within a month, the 2 pairs, we hope, will be sorting out nesting locations, and then they'll become much more difficult to see. So February, early March is the best time to see them.
Another hand up, come on. Over there. Trevor. Mike's coming over.
Darren, is it more than a coincidence the rise and success of the otter has coincided with the demise of the water vole?
I think that's they're just total coincidence. Otters will take water voles, definitely. They will prey on water voles that happen to be out and about. They're opportunists, so they will get them. They have no impact whatsoever on a population. So I think that the two are mutually exclusive, really.
More hands. Paul over here.
Dr. Alan Walker, the survey you did, I think it was Poole Harbour. Now, you said the eels went up, I presume it's the River Frome, up to Wareham. You mentioned also about lights. Now, I know from holidaying in Wareham that you've got a lot of lights at Wareham Quay. Is that why they stopped and decided to go back down again? And what time of year was that survey done? So 2 questions.
Just checking I'm not doubling up here on microphones. Is that all right? There's no feedback. They went up as far as Wareham because that's where our top receiver was. So they may have gone a little bit further than that, but not very far. The timing was from June through to December. And by December, sort of November, December, the movements were far less. They were coming down. So it was mostly over the summer. And the streetlights were, it's more an observation from the whole of the study rather than being something that's specific to that area. But it's a good point. It's a good question.
Down the back there.
It's a question for Adrian Parr. The surveys that you showed at the end there, did you have records coming from each of the squares on each of the 3 time scales?
I suppose that in a sense the surveys were done, well, as thoroughly as possible. It was a little bit of an ad hoc basis. So essentially we got in records from whoever would supply them, whenever they'd supply them. So yeah, the pattern of distribution over the years does vary, and there are some areas which are very well recorded and other areas less so. So yeah, the data is very much an average, but that's, I think, the only way we could sensibly cope with it. Yeah.
It just looked as if the period where the orange dots were, the records were so much smaller.
Yeah, okay. There are 2 reasons for that. The intervening period is one, the way the maps are done, the orange and the blue dots are the same size. So if there's a blue dot and an orange dot together, the orange dot gets hidden. So one of the time periods is actually partially hidden by that map because it's the less relevant data. So we decided to do it the other way. And again, recording intensity with all of these atlas things tends to peak and trough. If you have a study, interest goes up and you get a lot of records, and then things drift down again. So one has to be a little bit careful in interpreting it. But I think we've done reasonably well, actually.
Okay, thanks very much.
Adrian's being a bit modest there. If you compare the data from the 92 atlas, 7,000 records, if you look at the modern period that he's just finished surveying, 21,000 records, so roughly 3 times the amount of data. And that's largely down to groups like British Dragonfly Society and the greater interest. So there is a deal to be taken into account of the different volumes of data.
Not so much a question, more of a comment. First of all, thank you all very much for a wonderful array of talks. I very much enjoyed it. This is for Adrian, really. I remember in 1995, Howard, who wrote the original book, and I were in Yarmouth Cemetery. Do you remember when all the yellow-winged darters came in?
Yes, that was
and
back
in
1995. Yes, that's. We've had some similar times. 2006 was another exceedingly good year, but it were different species that came in. That's the one thing I love about wildlife and wildlife recording, is that every year is different.
That's right.
Every year has its fresh excitement.
The remarkable thing about that is Yarmouth Cemetery, there's never been so many live people in there. The trouble was they were walking all over the graves and doing quite a bit of damage. But Howard and I were walking around, and the thing that everybody seemed not to notice was not so much the yellow-winged dives, but the enormous number of migrants.
Yeah.
And because they are fairly common dragonfly with us, nobody seemed to notice the remarkable numbers.
My own interest, I've got a specialist interest in dragonfly migration, but it's somewhere along the line got sidetracked a little. I've got an interest in, well, as Martin mentioned earlier on, I'm on the National Records Committee, and somehow that interest in migrants has got diverted into monitoring the rarities, which is not really what I'd like to be doing. I think a lot of dragonflies, they fly very powerfully. They're a lot more dispersive than people give them credit for, and I think a lot of the common species are strongly influenced by migration. It's just that it's very difficult to pick up migrants of species that are also resident. There is some work looking at stable isotopes to try and track the natal origin of individual dragonflies, and that's starting to work quite well in the States, but the latest I've heard is that in Europe it doesn't seem to hold quite so well. I think in the States weather and climate tend to be much the same, but in Europe the weather is much more variable, so although you can get correlations based on climate, that doesn't always hold on a year-to-year weather basis. So still some way to go on tracking movements of species that are also resident.
Thank you.
This lady at the front here.
Thank you. This is for Alan. Two questions I have on the eels. When they go to Sargasso Sea, I believe the reason that it's not very easy to actually observe them spawning is because they're believed to do so at great depths. And the second question is, do they spawn and die, or do they come back and go back again, and how long do they live?
Okay, to work in reverse then, as far as we understand, they spawn and die. So we don't have any observations of any coming back. So therefore, how old are they? They can be as young as just 3 or 4 years old, particularly in the southern part of the range. In the northern part of the range, they can be over 60 years old. The oldest one that was found in a loch in Ireland that was aged was just about 60 years old. And there is a story of one that was stuck down a well in Sweden that was over 100 years old. And that kind of relates to our reservoirs and anywhere else where the eels are stuck and can't get back out. They can just keep going, for a long time. We haven't seen them and we haven't caught them in the Sargasso to know at what depth they're spawning. But the larvae do turn up around about the 400 meters depth, I think. I could be wrong on that one. But I think they do turn up at that depth. So again, the assumption is that that's where the spawning takes place, because that's where they see them. But it's that sort of anecdotal level. Yeah.
Visitors to Ipswich Museum may remember we had the oldest living eel in captivity, which was somewhere in its 40s when it escaped its tank, never to be seen again. Alana, you had a question over there.
Hi, my question's for Dr. Trevor Bond. I loved your examples of the restoration of rivers going on in East Anglia. That's great. It sets the benchmark for restoring degraded rivers. My question is, what is the mechanism that the EA use to stop landowners from degrading these rivers in the first place?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm surprised, as the only EA speaker, I haven't been booed or kind of had more challenging questions, because I think there's a lot in the press at the moment about our organisation, and I think it's questions like that people want answers to. So I think one of the things to bear in mind is there is a long history of our organisation performing quite a different function to the one it does now. And obviously in 1994 we were no longer the National Rivers Authority and we became the Environment Agency, but prior to that and even following on from that we were still maintaining rivers as you would not expect. And even today we're still dredging the Somerset levels. So I think there are some questions around that. What we do have are the powers to enforce landowners who do dredging activity in our rivers. That's under the Water Resources Act. And we currently have a number of cases across Suffolk where we are taking action against people that have done what we call hydromorphology harm. We're also trying to attend events like this to get the message out, but also attend events for the NFU and other organisations where the message maybe isn't as well received. Certainly what we're trying to do on the ground is as best as we can. I've spoken to a number of people today. We've got some really passionate environmentalists within my department in particular. And irrespective of what comes out of government, and irrespective of the political spin that is sometimes given to things and what the media say, we're always going to be working for the environment. And I hope that that was portrayed in my presentation today. It's about influencing, it's about education, it's about taking the messages which I'm giving to a converted audience here beyond this, getting things in the East Anglian Daily Times and beyond that, and making sure that we're not just preaching to the converted, but that we're actually, selling that message wider. And I want everyone in this room to go and do that, and I'll fully support that in any way that I can personally.
A question probably for Jeremy and anyone else, I suppose. I work in a park that has a lot of problems with dogs disturbing ponds. I don't know if what people think about, is it an underappreciated problem in sort of, if you've got a nature reserve where other, shall we say, effects probably aren't as high, and Jeremy's probably familiar with the New Forest, and is it a Dog Action Group, I believe they're called, they're throwing their weight around a bit, and spreading, and speaking to Naomi, she mentioned a potential new problem of sort of flea treatments and worming treatments from dogs perhaps accumulating in ponds, and is that something that needs research, do you think?
Some of you might be surprised to hear that having dogs in the water is a problem at all, and if you haven't ever heard of that problem, have a look at some of the pictures we posted just after Christmas on Twitter. Had a fantastic picture from a very good nature reserve in Kent actually, which was protecting doing a very good job protecting populations of a rare water plant called three-lobe crowfoot, which flowers just in winter. It's a winter green plant. Lives in shallow, often gravelly ponds. And there was lots of it on the reserve, but there was one pond in particular where there was a fence down the middle of it. On one side of the fence there was public access and plenty of visitors coming to the site to walk their dogs. It was a very popular local spot. On the other side there was no dog access, and the place where there was no dog access looked like a beautiful pond full of plants, including the endangered species. And on the other side, where the dogs were accessing, there were really no plants at all. It was just brown water. And in shallow, small waters, a regular succession of dogs jumping in the pond, which seems like just a lovely thing, natural, perfectly harmless, actually has quite a big impact. And this is often quite noticeable, particularly on heathland nature reserve sites, which also happen to have some of the best quality ponds on them. Dealing with that is obviously a tricky issue to handle sensitively, and often the best way is actually to provide sacrificial ponds for the dogs to swim in, because they will damage the ponds, they will make them of less value for wildlife, and then have better protection on remaining sites which are ideally well located away from public access routes. I mean, the odd dog, one dog jumping in a pond once a week would be completely harmless. A dog jumping in a reasonably fast-flowing river, which already has quite a pollutant burden, would also be harmless. A dog jumping into a gravel pit lake would have virtually no impact, no discernible impact. So it is something to worry about. It's a problem really of not enough nice ponds and the pressure of people going to places where there isn't, because there's not enough nice places to go to, basically. The issue with neonicotinoids potentially in dog collars is a possible issue that we don't know really anything about at the moment. We have seen the odd pond which seems strangely lifeless, really genuinely lifeless, not just someone proper looking and seeing there aren't any inverts in there. Now, having said that, neonics, there are lots of inverts that neonics wouldn't affect anyway, like mollusks and I suspect also crustaceans, but we have no idea about it really, and it would be a very interesting piece of investigation. And actually, the knowledge of what dogs are doing on heathland ponds even is pretty superficial. It's sort of it's well-observed anecdotes in a lot of different places. No one's actually really ever done any careful observations before and after, take the dogs away, whatever, that kind of work. So it would actually be quite a neat little project and quite doable, actually.
Thanks. There was an urgent question at the back there. Is that
There's
Jeff?
a follow-up? Just to
say, I've done a little bit of research.
Sorry.
It's not strictly scientific, it's just one pond that was fenced off. And before the Reeds took it over, it did, well, one end didn't have dog impact, one end did. And there's a clear difference in both the fauna and flora diversity, being negative towards the dogs, obviously.
That sounds completely convincing. Lots of us who look in ponds quite a lot have that kind of. We've seen that sort of thing. It's a bit like the example from the Kent place, really. Yeah, absolutely.
Right at the back.
Thanks. Sorry, two related eel questions. One is, what mapping has been done on the Gulf Stream and the other major Atlantic ocean currents? Because a 1 degree change in the Sargasso Sea to the west magnifies itself to perhaps 10 to 15 degrees by the time it's got to Iceland. Is it not possible that they're completely missing Europe on the way back? And my second question, which is also to Trevor on your right, is that to help eel and fish passage on the Waveney, we had a wonderful 2 years ago flood control structure pulled right out of the bed of the river, improved the river 150% immediately. If we were able, I don't think we're being serious about eel passage on these agency structures for a start. I think we're not doing it, we're not even monitoring it. And there are a lot of other workarounds. For instance, at Limbourne Mill, Workwell Mill, there is a wonderful little stream, and I think we had an illustration called Sophie's Stream, which completely bypasses the structure. And that was done by Sophie from the Environment Agency 10 years ago, cost nothing, and is the perfect solution. I don't think we're really serious about fish and eel passage improvements, certainly on major main channels like the Waveney and possibly the Stour.
Thank you. I'll start on that one. On the ocean currents one, it's not my field. Others would know far more about it. But so all I can say is kind of repeat what I said in the talk, that there is substantial monitoring of ocean currents. But because we don't understand how the fish use those, it's difficult to relate those changes in ocean currents to actually something that happens for us. As I was speaking to after my talk, the American eel also spawns in the Sargasso Sea, and they are showing, they don't have to travel nearly so far, and they travel in a different direction, and yet the American eel has shown a similar relative decline over these past few decades. So and the Japanese one has in the Pacific as well. So there are global issues as well as local issues on that. To go on to the passage one, I think you're right. There's an awful lot that can be done for fish passage, both fish, eels specifically, and fish in general. The challenge is getting it done and having the money to get it all done. A personal slight concern I have with the eel passage work at the moment is that it's great, but if we don't get more eels, all we're doing is spreading around what we've got already. So it can't be the only solution. We have to do something else, which means that we've got more eels to fill up this new habitat. And that might relate to other fish species as well. I don't know, Trevor, do you feel?
Yeah, if that's all right. Yeah, cheers for that, Jeff. It's good to have this chat about it. I think one of the major issues we have in East Anglia is structures. impounding structures on our river. And I think removing those is a very quick win to enable eel and fish passage. I think one of the challenges comes when you have lots of other competing interests. They can be aesthetic, so an artificially retained water level. An example would be the River Waveney. You take all the structures out of the Waveney, the water level is going to drop by about 1 metre in most locations. People are going to be happy with that. And you've also got the fact that you've got competing interests from things like the various canal trusts that are kind of popping up all around. We have one on the Gipping, and there are others across Suffolk as well. And obviously they want to actually put in more structures and return the rivers to being navigable. So there is that conflict which we do have to resolve. I think Alan's point is bang on as well. Even if you reconnect these rivers longitudinally, where are the eels actually going to go? Do we have that habitat? And there isn't one silver bullet for all of these issues, but it's important that we do lots of different things at the same time to answer the question. So structure removal and bypassing existing structures, definitely, but it has to be done in combination with these habitat improvements that I discussed in my talk, and it's all part of the answer to hopefully improve the situation for eels.
And I think it would, is this on? Yes, it's on. I think it would be worth just people keeping in mind that we shouldn't be thinking about rivers purely in morphological terms, because although a lot of rivers do have obstructions to the passage of larger organisms on them, these obstructions make no difference at all to the smaller creatures. That's pretty clear that they can pass a lot of them. So it's very important for fish. But what we're also forgetting is the elephant in the room, which is water quality. If you look at a landscape as we are doing in detail, between Leicester and Peterborough, where we're doing our water-friendly farming project, if you look at the water across that landscape, 95% of all fresh water in that landscape has damaging levels of nutrient pollution. Just nutrient pollution, never mind other pollutants in it. And this is the elephant in the room that we shouldn't forget about. This is the major impact on fresh waters, and we just need to think about the implications of that, because tackling that is actually a very challenging problem. We have really no very good technologies yet for deciding how to reduce nitrogen pollution. We can do a bit on it, but we've not done that brilliantly. And we struggle as well, apart from cleaning up taking away sewage works inputs, we struggle as well with the diffuse phosphorus in the landscape. So we've got a lot to do there. It's a big, big problem. I would say bigger than the structures issue.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question and we'll have to wrap it up. So, sorry.
Hi. One for David. You were talking about hypersaline streams on the continent, and I was thinking whether this would apply to marine environments and why we don't see that many marine beetles, or if any.
So the question is, why are there virtually no marine beetles? Yeah, I mean it's the case that there's virtually no marine insects, and it's definitely not a sort of physiological problem, because in these hypersaline systems, like those coastal rock pools that I mentioned, which actually those, I say they're hypersaline, I mean they're fluctuating from being saturated salt solution to being practically fresh water, and beetles and some chironomids are some of the few things that can cope with it. Similarly, with these inland saline systems, insects are the dominant taxa in many of them. I mean, there's a few crustacea, but it's often insects. I think it's the short answer to the question is we don't know, but I think the likelihood is it's because crustacea are already there. So it's ecologically difficult for insects to sort of penetrate those environments. And if you like, one of the keys to insect success in terrestrial stroke freshwater environments is flight and the ease of being able to move between patchy habitats. That's no good in a marine system. And I mean, the other way of looking at it, I suppose, if you accept the fact that insects nest within the crustacea from an evolutionary perspective, you could say that insects are just terrestrial and freshwater crustacea anyway, yeah? If that helps.
Thank you. Right, I think that's probably all we've got time for question time, as we run a little late, and I'm sure there are many of you who want to get off home. But it would be remiss if I didn't now make a few thank yous. So while we've got the speakers on the stage, I think we can give them all a round of applause for a fantastic day. feel free to go.